New York City is recognized as the center of the Italian-American Mafia because it is the headquarters of the infamous Five Families. The start of those organizations began in the 1890s when Sicilian immigrant Peter Morello settled in the area and founded what would evolve into the Genovese family. But it's believed that before coming to New York, he spent time in Texas and Louisiana. And in the city of New Orleans, there were two rival mafia families that had their beginnings during the 1880s, a full decade before the Mafia in New York would get its start. And as these two groups grew in power, they soon found themselves in conflict with each other, which in turn got the attention of the public, with pressure put on law enforcement to bring justice to these foreign criminals. The Mafia of the 1880s decided to fight back against the government with brutal tactics that were meant to strike fear into anyone who opposed them. Unfortunately for them, the people in the post-Civil War Deep South were not going to roll over, and they took justice into their own hands when the law seemed powerless. And when they were done, the Mafia of New Orleans was almost wiped out. Here is their story. But before we begin, if you end up enjoying this video, please be sure to give us a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you. The island of Sicily, off the coast of Italy, has seen more than its fair share of invaders since recorded history began. The Phoenicians, Carthage, Roman Empire, Greece, Byzantine Empire, Arabs, French, and Germans had all at one time or another claimed and ruled over the island. The Romans held on to the island the longest, and during the 600 years of their occupation, they transformed the place from a forest into plantation estates, where slaves grew wheat that was shipped to the Italian mainland. After the fall of the empire, these slaves became serfs, and the owners of the estates became feudal lords. The island became heavily divided between the wealthy ruling class, who were few, against the poor peasants that far outnumbered them. This division created a lot of amnesty against the powerful, and the Sicilians developed a distrust for government authority as part of their culture. By the 18th century, little had changed in the island's social structure in over 1,000 years, despite the constant revolving door of occupiers. It was as if the Renaissance and Enlightenment skipped over the island, leaving it still in the Dark Ages. No one is exactly sure of where, when, or how the word mafia originated, but it was first recorded in an 1863 play called Il Mafiosi della Vicara. The word was already in popular speaking use, and it was used to describe the strong men that the estates hired for enforcement and protection. During the second half of the 19th century, the closed island of Sicily began to be noticed by the rest of Europe. Giuseppe Garibaldi visited the island during his quest to unite Italy in the 1860s, and he recognized the power that the strong men and their gangs had. He used them as proxies to help bring the island under his control. Although the term mafia existed at this point, we will refrain from using it to describe this period, as the groups that would evolve into that organization were at this time more like a loose network of unorganized bandits. By 1875, the Victorian Age was in full swing, and the Industrial Revolution transformed Europe and America. But Sicily was still an undeveloped backwater that was full of dangerous crime. But for an enterprising businessman, a developing market has the potential for huge growth with limited competition that could create a fortune for the bold. British businessman John Forrester Rose thought this island could provide an opportunity to make him filthy rich, and so he decided to put his boots on the ground to see what was there before making any actual investments. It turned out to be the worst mistake he would ever make. At the Vicara Friedi train station, he was kidnapped by a group of bandits led by Antonio Leone. Leone sent a ransom demand to the British government for £5,000. The government was reluctant to pay, as this would incentivize others to kidnap more of their citizens, and in their hesitation, one of Mr. Rose's ears was mailed to them as proof that the kidnappers were not playing around. The British then tried to negotiate, but their offer was counteroffered with Rose's second ear. They paid the ransom, and an earless John Forrester Rose was returned alive. The British Empire was the most powerful country in the world during this time, and they were furious. They pressured the Italian government to send a response to Leone and his gang. The Italian army was dispatched and hunted the bandits down. A battle broke out that resulted in Leone and most of his gang being killed, but one of them, Giuseppe Esposito, escaped and went on to take control of the remnants of the crew. They moved into the mountains to avoid the authorities and regain their strength. But their prosperity was only temporary. Soon the gang was ambushed and captured by the government. Esposito managed to evade them again, but he realized the writing on the wall and figured that his best chance was to turn himself over to the corrupt officials that were in his pocket. He was then transferred to Palermo to await trial, and somehow he magically escaped. With Italy no longer safe, he fled to southern France and decided that his best chance was to leave Europe. He first boarded a ship to New York, where he entered the country, and then moved on to New Orleans to join a newly established Italian community. And it was there in the late 1870s that he founded what could then be called America's first mafia crime family. The history of the Italian mafia in America can be divided into two phases. The second one that we are most familiar with began in 1931, and it's known as Cosa Nostra. This is when Lucky Luciano took control of organized crime following the Castella Marise War, and he established the official families, rules, and the commission to rule over the country's entire underworld. But the period before this is known as the Black Hand. This began when bandits from Sicily arrived in America during the 19th century and started gangs that would develop into the families of Cosa Nostra. It was a cruder time when many rules were unspoken and not clear, but as the mafia became more Americanized, it also became more sophisticated. New Orleans had had Italian gangsters since 1860, starting with Raphael Agnello. He led a gang from Palermo, and after the Civil War, he tried to consolidate control over the other Sicilian gangs in the city. In 1869, he was rewarded with a gunshot to his head, and his brother Joe assumed leadership. A war broke out between the gangs that lasted until 1872 with Joe's death. For the remainder of the 1870s, the Italian gangs were fractured without one person in control. But that was about to change with the arrival of a powerful mafiosi from Sicily. When Giuseppe Esposito arrived in New York in 1879, he was a fugitive on the run from his own country. He traveled under the false name of Vincenzo Rebello, and he quickly made his way to New Orleans, where a small and growing Italian immigrant population was prospering. It is said that Esposito tried to start a new life by becoming a fisherman, but humble work did not suit him, and he soon quickly fell back to the gangster skills he developed in Sicily. Not every Italian immigrant in New Orleans wanted an honest living, and there were some criminals already in the population when he arrived. Esposito was able to bring them together into his own gang, called the Black Hand, thanks to his reputation from his old country. Esposito's right-hand man in his quest to take over the underworld of 19th century New Orleans was another Italian named Joe Provenzano. Together they created what would be traditional mob businesses. They controlled the dock workers through violence and intimidation, which gave them control over the port and the businesses that depended on it. They also began to shake down local Italian-owned businesses for protection money, which in reality meant you pay me not to harm you. At the same time, he built up a fleet of fishing boats to maintain a legitimate business front. And most Americans were blissfully unaware that the mafia was flourishing in the city that acted as the gateway to the Mississippi River. But as his prominence grew, the smaller gangs there were faced with two choices: join him or become an enemy. Tony Labruzzo was a criminal that arrived in the U.S. before Esposito, and he didn't appreciate this newcomer moving in on his market share of the extortion business. He knew that he didn't have the strength to stand up to the new boss, but he was not going to bend the knee either. So, he broke what was then an unspoken rule and ratted to the Italian consulate that a wanted criminal from Sicily was hiding out in New Orleans. The Italian consulate hired the private detective firm of Mooney and Boland to follow up on this lead and track the wanted fugitive down. On July 5th, 1881, the private detectives were aided by New Orleans police detectives Mike and David Hennessey as they tracked Esposito down to the St. Louis Cathedral. Esposito was swiftly arrested and transported to New York for an extradition hearing. But while he didn't put up a fight with the cops, his time in America taught him that the liberal justice system could be easily manipulated. Members of the Italian community in New Orleans traveled to New York to testify on his behalf as character witnesses. Esposito also protested that the police captured the wrong man, and he was really Vincenzo Rebello. But by September, the authorities were positive that they captured the real Giuseppe Esposito, and they deported him to Rome. In the ancient city, the Mafia of Sicily had little influence. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. We don't know exactly when he died. Esposito left behind a wife and child in New Orleans, and after his deportation, the crime family he founded did not take care of them, and their fate became lost in time. Likewise, the family that he founded was not organized enough for a peaceful transition of leadership, and it ended up splitting apart. Joe Provenzano would lead one faction with his brother, while the other group was led by Charles and Tony Mantranga. Very little documentation exists about the activities of the New Orleans Mafia in the 1880s, but we can probably assume that the initial split between the two factions started as amicable, But eventually they hit a point where one could only gain market share at the expense of the other. And in the gangster world, that is considered an act of war. What we do know for sure is that these two groups, plus one of the detectives who took down Esposito and became a police chief, would all become intertwined in 1890 when a violent conflict would break out that would expose the Mafia to the American public for the first time. And the people in the Deep South wouldn't take so kindly to it. America during the 19th century was a magnet for immigration from Europe. People from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and many other countries would arrive in cities like New York, and from there they would spread into all corners of the rapidly growing nation. David Hennessey, one of the detectives that arrested Giuseppe Esposito in 1881, was the son of Irish immigrants. His father, David Sr., fought for the Union during the Civil War, and during the Reconstruction era, he was a member of the Metropolitan Police. He would be murdered by a fellow policeman in 1869 when David Jr. was just 11 years old. Perhaps the death of his father fueled a passion for justice in the young boy, because he would grow up to follow his father's footsteps by joining the police and eventually rising to the top job of chief. Just 1 year after his father's murder, he was employed by the police force as a messenger. When he was only a teenager, he caught two thieves in the act, beat them with his bare hands, and dragged them to the police station. When he turned 20 years old, he was promoted to detective. The capture of Giuseppe Esposito made him a star in the city of New Orleans. But 1882 would derail his meteoric rise when he was tried for the murder of a fellow policeman. He claimed self-defense and was acquitted of the charges, but he decided to resign from the police force to protest that his case had actually made it to trial. New Orleans in the 1880s was a growing city with a huge crime problem. In the aftermath of Reconstruction, federal troops were pulled from the city with the idea that the locals would go back to ruling themselves, this time with African Americans also having a say. The result was an outbreak of violence and chaos, which would eventually end with the establishment of the Jim Crow system. But Jim Crow and one-party rule by the Democrats was still in the future. To combat rising lawlessness, the politicians from both parties agreed that they would give police powers to private security companies as an emergency measure. David Hennessey went on to be employed by one of these firms, and so he was able to stay popular with the people as a public safety expert. He was personally put in charge of the security for the 1884 World's Fair in New Orleans. Newspapers from the time described his team as neatly uniformed, fine-looking, and an intelligent body of men, far superior to the regular city police force. In 1888, recently elected Mayor Joseph Shakespeare came to Hennessey with a job offer: become chief of police and reform our force. The offer was accepted, and over the next 2 years, the public began to notice improvements with their police department. While Hennessey's career was growing, so were the two mafia families of New Orleans. We're not exactly sure how many members were in the Provenzano and Matranga families, but we do know that in addition to being ruthless gangsters, the leaders of each group were also wealthy businessmen who would use the spoils of their legal and illegal businesses to grow their aspiring empires. Also, during the Black Hand period of the Mafia, it was not nearly as organized as it would be in 1931. We can assume that these families operated more like street gangs, with each side recruiting Italian immigrants with bandit experience into their ranks as soon as they stepped off the boats. In the early 1880s, in addition to businesses like brothels, saloons, and protection rackets, each family was heavily invested in the produce market that New Orleans was the center of. The Matrangas had control of the actual marketplace, where farmers would sell their goods to retailers, while the Provenzanos controlled the labor on the docks that the produce would enter the city from, with dock workers needing to kick up a percentage of their wages for the privilege of working. But in 1885, the dynamics changed, after Charles Matranga struck a deal with major produce importer and suspected mobster Joseph Macheca to provide labor for the unloading of his merchandise. With Matranga having the legal contract for providing the labor, along with the means to fight back against any violence that Provenzano could use to crush any other businessman who didn't have a violent gang to back him, the Provenzano family was muscled out of their racket on the docks. A feud began between the two groups, with violent incidents taking place. Now, because this was the Mafia, and it was also the early days of Italian immigration, almost no one outside of the little Palermo community was aware of what was happening, because gangsters and civilians all followed a policy of not speaking to the police. The fighting between the two groups took place over a few years, and it didn't have the shocking violence and high body count to upset the public like Al Capone's takeover of Chicago or the Castello Marise War in New York. But it did start to attract the attention of law enforcement. So by the time David Hennessey became chief of police, he was familiar with the Mafia already thanks to his experience with Giuseppe Esposito, and he quickly deduced that the violence in the Italian community was being caused by the people who once worked for the man he had captured and deported. Hennessey appears to have not had a favorite side in this fight, and each faction was attacked equally, with members from each group being arrested and sent to prison. Suddenly it appeared that this two-way war between rival gangs was turning into a three-way contest, with law enforcement now entering. The Mafia had no respect for the police in Sicily, and they would show the same contempt towards the American counterparts. And as ruthless as they were, this would turn out to be a huge and deadly miscalculation that would almost wipe them away. For New Orleans Chief of Police David Hennessey, the term Mafia just meant Italian hoodlums. He was aware that the leaders of these groups were prominent businessmen, but the guys on the street doing the dirty work were nothing more than common criminals in his opinion. But knowing that his resources were limited, he decided that the best way to end the feud between the Matrangas and Provenzanos was to broker a truce between the two leaders. And by the time 1890 rolled around, he did just that, and figured that New Orleans Mafia problems had been solved for now. But peace between the two groups unraveled on the early morning of May 6. After a late night of unloading fruit from a steamship, 6 stevedores from the Matranga family were heading home on a horse-drawn wagon. Newspapers from the time listed their names as Tony Matranga, Bastiano and Cardona, Anthony Locasio, Rocco Garacci, Salvatore Sinceri, and Vincent Caruso. As they approached Claiborne Street, an unknown amount of gunmen suddenly unleashed a volley of bullets into the wagon. 3 of the men in the wagon were wounded, with Tony Matranga's leg needing to later be amputated. The men in the wagon were armed and fired back, which prompted the gunmen to recede into the darkness and disappear into the night. To the Matrangas, it was obvious that the Provenzanos were behind the ambush, and they had betrayed the truce Hennessey brokered. The war would be back on. Hennessey likewise felt betrayed as well, and he personally took charge of all investigations into the Mafia. Taking down this organization had now just become very personal. Contemporaries and historians have referred to Hennessey as a partisan, because his response to the ambush was almost an exclusive persecution of members of the Provenzano family, while the Matrangas were able to carry on without much interference from law enforcement. But it was the Provenzanos who violated the peace, so it seems reasonable that the police chief saw them as the greater danger that needed to be removed from society first. And he might have also been playing a longer game against the Matrangas to take them down as well. Using the connections he built with Italian authorities, he was coming into the possession of information linking Matranga's men to criminal records in Sicily. We can assume that the purpose of this would be to arrest these men for the crimes they committed abroad and then extradite them back to Italy where they could be prosecuted, just like what happened to Giuseppe Esposito. So we know that Hennessey was not really a partisan in the feud that was turning into a war, and that both sides saw him as an immediate threat. One group decided that the best way to deal with the chief of police was to assassinate him. It would be an audacious move, but perhaps they figured that without the righteous David Hennessey at the helm, the police force in the city would revert back to its old corrupt and incompetent ways, and then they would be allowed to continue business as usual. But wouldn't they expect some kind of blowback? Maybe they were counting on the other side catching the blame for this, or maybe they thought that a move as audacious as murdering such a high-ranking government official would have an intimidating effect that would cause anyone thinking of bearing the consequences of their actions on them to think twice before acting. Whatever their motivations and rationales were, we just don't really know. But here is what was reported at the time of the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessey. On the evening of October 15th, he attended a meeting with the police commission that ended around 9 p.m., after which he returned to police headquarters. He was met there by Captain William O'Connor from the Private Boylan Protection Agency. O'Connor was hired by the city to act as a bodyguard for Hennessey, as there were several threats against his life from the Mafia. They hung out at police headquarters for about an hour and left the building a few minutes after 11 to walk to Hennessey's home. Heavy rains earlier in the day created flooding that blocked his most direct route home, forcing the men to make a detour. They stopped at an oyster saloon for a late dinner. Hennessey's final meal would end up being oysters and milk. At 11:30, they resumed their walk to Hennessey's house. When they were about a block and a half away, the two men parted ways for unknown reasons, as O'Connor was contracted to accompany the police chief all the way to his door. Hennessey, now alone, turned onto his street and continued his walk, when a young boy darted out from a doorway and whistled loudly. Suddenly, Hennessey was hit with a blast from a shotgun being fired from across the street. It destroyed his umbrella and his left hand, making it disabled. He drew his ivory-handled Colt revolver with his right hand, but before he could return fire, Another shotgun blast ripped through his legs and shattered his right knee, causing him to fall. A third blast unleashed pellets into his chest and face. He returned fire in the direction where he thought his attacker was shooting from. The gunfire attracted attention, and people looked out their windows to try and see what was happening. O'Connor, hearing the gunshots, rushed to the scene, but he was too late to save the man he was supposed to protect. As he lay there dying, he whispered to O'Connor, "They gave it to me, and I gave it back the best I could." When asked if he could identify his attackers, Hennessey replied with an anti-Italian slur. He died just moments later without giving any more information. Police Chief David Hennessey was a popular figure in the city of New Orleans, and rather than intimidating the people into accepting the Mafia, his murder would have the exact opposite effect, which would lead to an uprising that would see the New Orleans Mafia almost completely wiped out by the town's citizens themselves. We speculated earlier that the motive for the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessey was to intimidate the government from further going after the Mafia. Instead, the murder ended up having the opposite effect. Mass arrests were made in the Italian community, though most suspects were released because of a lack of evidence. Just a few days after the murder, Mayor Shakespeare gave a speech where he declared that Hennessey's murder was the result of Sicilian revenge, and he urged the citizens of New Orleans to teach these people a lesson they would never forget. He appointed a committee to investigate the existence of secret societies and devise a method to uproot and annihilate any that they find. Investigators put the blame on the Matranga family, and in February of 1891, 19 men were indicted by a grand jury. The list included Bastian Incardona and Salvatore Sansiri. Both men were dock workers that were ambushed and shot by the Provenzano family in May. Charles Matranga was also indicted, along with New Orleans-born businessman of Italian descent, Joseph Macheca. Two of the men who were arrested and indicted that probably had nothing to do with the murder were Pietro Monasterio and Antonio Marchesi. Monasterio owned the shop that the man with the shotgun was hiding outside of, while Marchesi was arrested on the suspicion that he was involved simply because he was good friends with Monasterio. But of the 19 men arrested, only 9 would be put on trial. 1,221 prospective jurors were summoned to court, and the attorneys went through 780 of them before the final 12th man was selected. 557 jurors were dismissed, either because they objected to capital punishment, disagreed with convictions based on circumstantial evidence, or they just plain out hated Italian immigrants. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Charles H. Lusenberg, while Lionel Adams represented the defendants. Jury selection ended on February 27th, and the opening arguments for the trial began on the 28th, which was a Saturday. On the second day of the trial, which was Monday, March 2nd, one of the defendants, Manuel Polizzi, made a disturbance. He refused to sit down and shouted in Italian. Judge Joshua Baker asked Charles Matranga to translate what Polizzi was saying, to which Matranga replied that he was demanding to have an interpreter. Baker instructed Matranga to talk to him, but after an exchange of a few words, Matranga informed the judge that Polizzi did not want to speak with him. Baker then instructed Joseph Macheca to be the interpreter, but Polizzi refused this as well. The trial was placed on hold, so an independent interpreter could be found. When one did arrive, Baker met with him, Polizzi, and the attorneys from both sides in his chambers. What was said was private, but when the trial resumed, the defense informed the court that it could no longer represent Polizzi. Polizzi tried to stay as distant as possible from the other defendants and was held in separate quarters at the jail, but the charges against him were not dropped. What happened behind the closed doors was later revealed by the defense attorneys to the press. Polizzi had confessed that he knew about the conspiracy to murder Hennessey, but he did not take part in the shooting. He also claimed to be home when the murder occurred, despite multiple witnesses placing him at the scene of the crime as a gunman. A few days later, Polizzi would have another outburst at court, and when he was removed to the sheriff's office, he attempted to jump out of a window, but was restrained and the trial went on. Interestingly enough, Captain O'Connor, the man who should have been with David Hennessey when he was gunned down alone, was not called as a witness. Closing arguments were made about 2 weeks later, and on March 13th, the jury returned with their verdicts. 6 of the defendants, including Matranga and Macheca, were found to be not guilty. For the other 3 men, which included Manuel Polizzi, the jury could not reach a verdict, resulting in a mistrial. But these men were not free yet. There were still other charges against them, and thus they were kept in jail until at least overnight when authorities could decide what to do next. In Little Palermo, the Sicilian community was said to be ecstatic about the verdict. It's rumored that an American flag was dragged through the mud, trampled, and then hung upside down under the Italian flag. But while the Italian community was celebrating, the Americans of New Orleans were outraged. Immediately following the verdicts, rumors began to spread that the jury was bribed to let David Hennessey's murderers go free. A community mass meeting was held that night where local politicians whipped up the crowd into a frenzy. If they could not find justice in a corrupt court, then they were going to obtain it by other means. They marched to the Orleans Parish Prison and overwhelmed the guards there by using a battering ram to break down the doors. In the end, all the warden could do to protect his prisoners was to let them out and tell them to hide the best they could. It was said that the crowd outside of the prison numbered in the thousands, with prominent politicians and officials in the mob. Most people remained outside, while those that went in functioned as professional executioners. This group included a future mayor. Once inside the prison, the rage of the city was unleashed, and 11 of the 19 people being held were murdered by the crowd. 9 of them were either shot or clubbed to death within the prison walls. This includes Antonio Marchesi and Pietro Monteserio. 2 men, Antonio Bagnetto and Manuel Polisi, were taken outside, where they were hung from a tree and then shot. Charles Matranga was able to successfully hide, while Joseph Macheca was not so lucky, and was one of the 9 men shot inside. When the dawn came, the crowd dispersed, leaving the 2 bodies swinging where they died. In the aftermath of this event, the court released all of the surviving prisoners and dropped the charges against them. The Italian government was appalled by the murder of their nationals, and this event caused a diplomatic rift. But in the United States overall, the general mood of the public approved of this event. Much anti-Italian prejudice was only directed at Southern Italians, whose darker skin tone made them racially suspect in the eyes of white supremacists. While 10 of the 11 victims were foreign-born, Joseph Macheca was an American citizen, born in New Orleans in 1843. He had even fought on the Confederate side during the Civil War. It was known that he was politically connected, and rumored that he controlled a street gang of Italian immigrants that was meant to intimidate Republicans while working directly for the local Democrat Party to commit voter intimidation and sometimes murder. His death was not mourned by the larger community. A grand jury was immediately convened to investigate the mob lynching of 11 Italian men. They declined to indict anyone for the killings and instead doubled down on the claim that the original trial must have been tainted due to jurors being bribed. But no one was ever charged for that alleged crime. While this event made national headlines and was trumpeted as a huge blow to the Mafia, the Matrangas and Provenzanos were not wiped out, although they were largely depleted in strength. But like the Mafia always does best, these organizations retreated into the shadows in order to build up their strength and make a comeback that few saw coming. David Hennessey was murdered during the height of the war between the Matrangas and the Provenzanos. The aftermath of his murder saw both organizations severely assaulted by the authorities. The Provenzanos were the weaker of the 2 groups, and when the Matrangas took control of the docks, they cut the Provenzanos out of their most lucrative source of income, which they were never able to recover from. In the following years, the Provenzanos ceased to exist, and it's assumed that what remained of them merged into the Matrangas, with Charles as the clear leader. While he was the undisputed boss of the New Orleans Mafia, he was not the most powerful man in the city and controlled what was basically just another gang. But Charles Matranga was still a prominent businessman, and the leadership of the organization was still intact following the lynchings of 1891. Plus, he seems to be a man that was capable of learning from his mistakes. The Mafia kept a low profile and retreated from the public eye. By 1900, there were few people who believed that they even still existed. In 1892, Mayor Shakespeare lost his re-election bid, and Matranga allied himself with the next administration. Matranga also created a new rule for his organization that seems to have been adopted by all mafia groups across the United States. Don't kill cops or other government officials. The retaliation is not worth the risk. In the following years, Matranga earned the nickname Millionaire Charlie because of all the wealth he accumulated. The Mafia under his leadership only had one public scandal, which occurred in 1907. A child named Walter Lamanna was kidnapped, and his affluent parents were threatened with a ransom of $6,000 for his return. Shortly after, the young boy was killed anyway. 4 men were arrested, and 1 was executed for the crime. But during the investigation, authorities learned that the Italian businesses in the city were paying protection money to the Mafia. Millionaire Charlie retired in 1922, shortly after the start of Prohibition, and he died many years later in 1943. Leadership was passed on to Silver Dollar Sam Carollo, who led the family until the 1940s, when he was deported. During his time, the family transitioned from Black Hand to Cosa Nostra, with Lucky Luciano's reorganization of the Mafia following the Castella Marise War. Carlos Marcello assumed control of the family in 1947. and that's when they became to be publicly known as the Marcello family, after the government began to investigate the existence of the National Crime Syndicate. He would control the family for more than 40 years. In the 1980s, Marcello went to prison, and his younger brother was made acting boss. But his leadership was poor, and he was forced out in 1990. Silver Dollar Sam Carollo's son, Anthony, took control of the family next. In 1993, Louisiana made video poker legal, and the New Orleans crime family wanted a piece. Anthony Carollo traveled to New York to get the blessing of the commission to monopolize this new source of income in his state. As he schemed the muscle in and seized control, his plans were picked up by FBI bugs. The FBI learned how weak the family had become, and how loose it now was as an organization. In 1994, an FBI sting, dubbed Operation Hardcrust, arrested Carollo and his associates. The following year he went to trial. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and released in 1998. In 2007, he passed away from natural causes. It appears that following the FBI takedown of the family, the Cosa Nostra Commission saw it best to dismantle the New Orleans family, as the Crescent City's talent pool was no longer up to the Mafia standards. By this point, the remaining members all had legitimate businesses that appeared to take precedence over their criminal ones. In 2003, the U.S. Attorney declared that the Marcello family was gone, and New Orleans was now considered an open city by the American Mafia. New Orleans was the place where the Mafia got its start in America, and the New Orleans family reflects the greater story of America and immigration. The first group was dirt poor, but through the generations, their descendants became prosperous. For this group of Sicilians, they became so assimilated into American culture that no one wanted to claim our thing. And now it appears to be a relic of the past.